Calder Haynes had come to the frozen mountains of Silverpine seeking silence, but his only companion, a husky named Storm, sensed something buried beneath the snow. During a routine trek, Storm suddenly abandoned the trail, pulling Calder toward a vast white valley no map had ever mentioned. What they found stopped him cold. The wreck of a military helicopter half entombed in ice, as if it had been waiting for him. Calder didn't know it yet, but this discovery wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of a truth someone died to protect, and a hunt that would turn him from the hunter prescribe. The winter over the Silverpine Range did not simply arrive. It settled in and refused to leave. A heavy white weight draped over the bones of Montana that turned every ridge into a ghost and every valley into a secret. Storms moved through like slow, grinding machines, packing the snow hard against black rock and stunted pine, sanding away tracks and memories until the mountain seemed untouched by anything human. On most days, the only signs of life out there were the thin line of smoke from a solitary cabin halfway up a slope, and the faint prints of a man and a dog moving through the drifts. The man was named Calder Haynes, and he looked as if the range had carved him for itself. Late 30s, maybe 40, tall but not bulky, all rope and rawhide, and the kind of strength that comes from hauling wood and shoveling snow more than lifting weights. His hair, once regulation short and almost black, had grown out into a rough cut threaded with early gray at the temples, while a close beard covered a jaw that had broken in 2 places and healed just crooked enough to give his face a permanent, stubborn tilt. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deep from wind and squinting into the sun off snowfields. But what stayed with people who actually met him were the eyes themselves, clear, watchful, a shade somewhere between green and amber, and almost always carrying the faraway look of a man listening to something only he could hear. He wore the same uniform most days, a worn brown leather jacket lined with flannel, a faded red and cream plaid shirt beneath, sturdy denim that had lost its original color, and mountain boots nicked with scars from rock and ice. Once, years ago now, those boots had stamped through the dust and heat of other continents. Calder had been a rescue specialist in an Air Force pararescue unit, trained to drop into hell and bring people back out. Until the mission, when he didn't. The helicopter had gone down in a sandstorm on the far side of the world, all roaring wind and spinning sky and sudden impact. When the smoke cleared and the dust settled, every friend he'd flown with was gone but him. The report called it a tragic accident. Whatever Calder called it, he stopped saying out loud. He carried their names in his chest like shrapnel. And when the world grew too loud, when the medals and speeches and questions became one endless roar, he packed what little he owned into an old truck and drove until the roads turned to gravel, then to ice, then to nothing. That was where he found the old cabin on the shoulder of Silverpine, and that was where he stayed. He might have stayed completely alone, if not for the dog. Storm had come into his life in a blur of blood and snow one brutal January 3 years back, half-starved and limping, eyes bright with a wild fear that matched the storm howling outside. Calder had found him tangled in a rusted trap near the tree line, fur matted with ice, teeth bared on a low, desperate growl. The dog could have torn into him. Instead, when Calder spoke in the same calm, clipped tone he'd once used for wounded soldiers, the animal went still and let him work. Now Storm was full-grown, a 4-year-old husky with a coat that looked like winter had decided to walk around on 4 legs, gray along the back, white at the belly and muzzle, darker smudges around keen, pale blue eyes. He moved the way water moves downhill, smooth and certain, every step placed as if the snow would obey him. Storm had a stubborn streak that could rival Calder's on a bad day, but under it lived a fierce loyalty and a strange, quiet sensitivity. The dog seemed to feel the tremors under Calder's skin when memories rose, nudging his hand or pressing his weight against the man's leg until the ghosts faded. The only other person who visited their mountain regularly was Emma Hale from Timbercrest, a small town of dim bar lights and battered trucks 2 valleys over. Emma was a veterinarian, though the word felt too clinical for the woman who arrived at ranches and homesteads with sleeves rolled up, dark hair braided back, and boots permanently dusted with straw and snow. She was in her early 30s, with a face that could look sharp as a scalpel in an emergency and then soften into something almost painfully kind once the crisis passed. The first time Calder met her, Storm had been the one on the table, sliced open by ice on a frozen creek. Emma had worked in silence for a long time, hands steady, eyes focused, and when she finally spoke, it was only to say, "You did good getting him here this fast." She'd saved the dog, and in some quiet way, she'd saved Calder too. After that, she'd show up now and then with a truck bed full of feed for nearby ranch dogs, or with vaccines and surgical kits, or simply an excuse to check on Storm. Somehow, those visits had become the only cracks through which warmth from the outside world slipped into Calder's cabin. On the morning everything changed. The mountains were swallowed by a storm that had rolled in during the night, thick and mean. The wind wailed down the gullies like something alive, driving walls of snow against the small windows until the world outside the cabin vanished. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed, fighting the cold that seeped through every log. Calder stood at the small sink, watching his breath cloud in front of him as he rinsed out a metal coffee mug. Storm lay by the door, head on his paws, eyes half closed but never fully asleep. Calder's shoulders were just beginning to lose their tense set when the dog stiffened all at once, ears pricking, nose cutting the air. A low rumble started deep in Storm's chest. "Easy, boy," Calder murmured, drying his hands on a rag. But the dog was already on his feet, claws clicking on the wood as he moved to the door. The growl turned into a sharp, urgent bark, nothing like the alert he gave for passing elk or the occasional wandering coyote. This was different. Storm cast a quick look over his shoulder, something almost human in the insistence of it, then pawed at the door with a whine that sounded like protest. Calder felt the old, familiar prickle at the back of his neck. Instinct, the same one that had kept him alive when the sky fell apart, whispered that this was more than an animal's restlessness. He grabbed his jacket, shrugged into it, slung the battered scoped rifle over his shoulder more out of habit than intention, and snapped a lead onto Storm's collar. The moment the door cracked open, the Storm lunged inside, a fist of cold air and snow that stole his breath. Storm darted forward, nearly pulling him off balance, but Calder dug his boots into the drift and let the dog lead. They moved into the white, the cabin disappearing behind them like a dream. The world shrank to the circle of space around their bodies, where wind whipped at his face and snowflakes stung his eyes. Storm did not follow any of the familiar paths, neither toward the creek, nor the old logging road, nor the line of snares Calder kept near the tree line. Instead, he cut a cross-slope, chest plowing through the drifts, head low, tail held in a focused line. Calder's legs burned as they climbed, then descended, then climbed again, following ridges and benches he knew only from years of wandering. Time blurred. Distance became a feeling more than a number. At last, the land began to fall away more sharply. Storm slowed, then stopped right at the lip of a rock outcropping, his paws sending a small cascade of powder over the edge. Calder came up beside him, and the storm wind caught his jacket, snapping it tight around his ribs. For a heartbeat, he saw nothing but snow and a sky the color of hammered steel. Then the valley below took shape, an immense bowl of white cradled by jagged peaks, the surface mostly smooth, except for the dark, unnatural line etched across it, like a wound. At the end of that scar lay the helicopter. Even from up on the cliff, Calder could see it had been there a long time. The fuselage lay at an angle, nose half buried, tail boom twisted and half sheared off. One rotor blade jutted from the snow at a broken angle, the others buried or gone. The matte paint that had once been some military shade of green or grey was now scabbed with rust and ice. Snow had built up around the body, draping over it in soft curves that couldn't quite hide the mechanical violence underneath. To anyone else, it might have looked like an old wreck, just another relic of some long-ago storm. To Calder, it was something else. The shape, the configuration of the cockpit, the way the avionics hump rose on its back, it all dropped into place in his mind. MH-5N Silent Hawk, a ghost bird, the kind of machine whispered about in certain hangars and never officially acknowledged. Only a handful of units had flown them. He'd seen them once, long ago, sitting at the edge of a classified airstrip like predators, waiting to be unleashed. What in God's frozen name was one doing here? A shiver ran through him that had nothing to do with the cold. Beside him, Storm sniffed the air, then lifted his muzzle and let out a long, eerie howl that rolled down the valley and bounced back from the stone, a sound that made Calder's skin crawl, as if the dog were calling to something buried under all that ice and metal. "All right," Calder muttered, more to himself than the animal. "You dragged me out here. Let's see why." The descent down into the valley was treacherous. Wind had polished some slopes into slick glass, while other sections hid loose rock beneath knee-deep powder. Storm picked a line without hesitation, checking back every so often to be sure Calder followed. By the time they reached the valley floor, Calder's calves burned and his fingers ached inside his gloves. Up close, the wreck loomed larger, the cockpit windows frosted opaque, the metal skin pitted and scarred. One door on the side hung crooked, half torn from its hinges, revealing a dark gap. The wind had died down slightly in the bowl, allowing the quiet to settle heavy around them. Calder approached slowly, one hand on the cold metal, his reflection a dull blur in the ice crusted along the fuselage. There was no sign of markings, no tail number, no flag, nothing to say who it belonged to. That alone sent another quiet alarm through him. He stepped to the cockpit, where one section of glass had shattered inward long ago, leaving jagged teeth around an opening filled with drifted snow. As he leaned in, the smell hit him. Not fuel or oil, those ghosts were long gone, but a faint metallic tang that reminded him of old blood and forgotten metal. Snow had packed into the pilot's seat, softening the harsh lines of the interior, but here and there the glint of instruments peeked through. Calder slid his gloved hand into the darkness, fingertips brushing cold plastic, bent switches, the edge of a harness buckle. Something small and solid shifted under his touch, then slid free with a soft clink, dropping into the snow at his boots. He pulled back and looked down. Lying on the white surface was a metal tag, no bigger than his thumb, attached to a short broken chain. Years in the weather had dulled its shine, but the lettering was still clear. For C.H. If you survived, follow the truth. For a long moment, the only sound in the valley was the thud of his own heartbeat in his ears. C.H. The initials sat on the metal like a blow. Calder Haynes. The tag could have belonged to anyone, he told himself. Could have been some other C.H., some mechanic, some pilot. But as he turned it over in his fingers, feeling the cold bite into his skin even through the glove, he knew better. This had been left, placed, not for some nameless figure, but for him. as if someone had known he would find this wreck in this forgotten valley, or had at least gambled that one day he wouldn't be able to resist the pull of these mountains. Storm whined softly and pressed against his leg, blue eyes fixed not on the wreck, but on his face, as if measuring the change there. Calder slid the tag into an inner pocket of his jacket, where it rested against his chest like a question carved in ice. The climb back to the cabin felt longer, not because the snow had deepened or the wind had grown worse. If anything, the storm was starting to break, but because the world he'd left behind that morning no longer existed. Every tree, every drift, every familiar boulder seemed charged with a new electricity, as if he were walking across the skin of something vast and awake. By the time the cabin's dark shape emerged from the thinning curtain of snow, the sky had lifted into a low, bruised gray, and distant pale light pushed at the horizon. Smoke still rose from the chimney, thank God. He hadn't been gone long enough for the fire to die. What he hadn't expected to see was the figure standing on the porch. Emma Hale hugged her parka close, the hood fur-trimmed and rimed with ice, dark hair escaping in damp wisps around a face flushed by cold and worry. Her old Chevy was half buried in a drift near the stand of spruce, tires chained, windshield frosted. She turned at the crunch of his boots, relief flaring in her hazel eyes, before it was chased by exasperation. "Calder, do you have any idea what this storm looks like from town?" she called over the wind, voice sharp but shaking. "You vanish off the radio and then—" Her words cut off as she took in his expression, the snow and ice crusted on his jacket, the way he one-handedly patted Storm as if to reassure the dog more than himself. "What happened?" Inside, the cabin felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing close as the storm's howl became a muffled roar. Emma shrugged off her parka, revealing a cable-knit sweater and jeans dusted with snow, then moved automatically to the stove, feeding the fire without being asked. Calder stood by the table, the heat barely touching the chill that had settled inside him. Storm paced once in a tight circle, then sprawled near the door, muscles still coiled, eyes flicking between the two humans. Calder reached into his jacket and set the tag on the scarred wooden tabletop. Emma's brows drew together as she stepped closer. "What is it?" "From a crash," he said, surprised by how rough his own voice sounded. "Down in a valley I've never seen before. Storm dragged me out there." He told her in short, clipped phrases about the wreck, about the silent hawk lying broken in the snow, about the way the valley had felt like walking into a memory he didn't know he had. When he reached the part about the cockpit and the tag falling into the snow, he fell silent and let the metal speak for itself. Emma picked it up carefully, turning it between finger and thumb. As she read the inscription, the color drained from her face, leaving her freckles stark against skin gone suddenly pale. Her eyes flicked to him, wide and stunned, then away, as if the room had tilted under her feet. For a moment she said nothing, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the occasional thump of Storm's tail against the floorboards. Then, softly, "For CH, if you survived, follow the truth." She whispered the words like they were a line from a story she'd heard before, one she'd hoped never to see written in the real world. The confusion in her gaze hardened into something older, fear, recognition, and a decision she'd been putting off for years. She set the tag back down with a tiny click, then did something she'd never done before in all her visits to the cabin. She reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was steady. Calder felt the surprise of the contact, like a spark up his arm. "Calder," she began, and his name on her lips carried more weight than any rank he'd ever worn. "I think I know who sent this to you." Outside, the wind slammed against the walls, rattling the small window panes. Inside, the air seemed to hold its breath. He studied her face, the tightness around her mouth, the shine in her eyes. "Emma," he said slowly, "you're scaring me." A short, humorless laugh escaped her. "You're not the only one." She drew in a breath, steadying herself. "Do you remember I told you once that I came out here because I didn't have much reason to stay in Timbercrest except the clinic?" He nodded. He remembered the way she'd said it, light at the surface but with something heavy underneath. "I didn't come here alone," she went on. "I had a sister, Lyra. She was older than me by 4 years, and she lived in a world of numbers and engines and skies. She became an aerospace engineer, one of the good ones. 6 years ago, she was recruited into some classified project she couldn't talk about. To you from the outside, it looked like a dream. Big salary, big promises." Emma's gaze drifted to the fire, as if she could see her sister's face there. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. She got quiet, jumpy, kept checking the windows like she expected someone to be watching. And one night, she came to my place, put her hands on my shoulders and said, "If things ever go bad, if someone comes asking questions you don't like, there's one person in this world you can trust. A soldier named Calder Haynes." The room fell very still. Calder felt the words land in him like distant artillery, echoes rolling out into places he'd walled off long ago. "I'd never met you," Emma said, eyes returning to his. "Never heard your name before that night. And when I asked her who you were, she just shook her head and said there were things safer not spoken aloud. 2 weeks later, Lyra disappeared. Official story said she resigned and left the country. I never believed it." She swallowed, jaw tightening. "So when I saw that dog of yours in town one winter, half frozen and bleeding, and then I saw who carried him into my clinic. You want to know the truth, Calder? I wasn't surprised. It felt like the universe finally cashing in on a promise I didn't understand." Storm lifted his head at the sound of his name, ears flicking forward, as if recognizing his part in a much older story. Calder's mind spun, trying to knit scattered facts into a shape that would make sense. The secret of helicopters, the accident that had wiped out his team, the faceless officials who'd hurried him through debriefings and back out into a world that no longer fit. Now a wrecked, silent hawk in a hidden valley, a tag bearing his initials, and a woman who'd known his name before she'd seen his face. All because of a sister tied to some classified project. The conclusion rose in him like a slow, inevitable tide. "That chopper," he said quietly. "My team. Lyra's project. None of it was an accident." Emma's eyes were shining now, not just with fear, but with something fiercer underneath. Grief sharpened into resolve. "Storm didn't just stumble on that wreck," she agreed. "Lyra used to say the truth has its own gravity. Maybe she found a way to pull you toward it." He looked toward the small window. Beyond the misted glass, the storm raged on, snowflakes streaking past like stars. Somewhere out there, in that white wilderness, the helicopter lay waiting, holding a dead woman's secrets and a dead unit's unanswered questions. He felt the weight of the tag against his chest, pressing like a second heartbeat. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, the low ceiling, the stacked wood, the old photographs on the wall, everything suddenly too small to hold what had just entered. Storm rose and padded closer, settling at his feet, gaze fixed on the door with a sharp, alert focus, as if already guarding against threats neither of them could see yet. Calder tightened his hand around the metal tag until the edges bit into his palm. "If the truth is calling," he said at last, voice low but steady, "I'll go to it. But you are not getting dragged into this, Emma." She shook her head before he'd even finished, a shimmer of stubborn light in her eyes that matched the one in his. "Calder," she murmured, squeezing his hand, "I've been tangled up in this since the night my sister disappeared. Long before you showed up with a half-dead husky on my table." A gust hit the cabin hard enough to make the lamp flame shudder, shadows leaping across the log walls like ghostly figures. The mountains outside howled and whispered in the same breath, as if the Silver Pine Range itself had been waiting for this moment as long as they had. Somewhere between that wind and the warm circle of light around the table, a story older than any of them shifted, coming awake. And in its first quiet chapter, a mountain. Man, a husky, and a woman with grief in her eyes sat together in a small cabin, listening to the storm and to the distant call of a truth buried in snow. The storm eased sometime near dawn, leaving the mountains hushed beneath a sky the color of cold steel. And when Calder stepped out of the cabin with Storm at his heel and Emma still rubbing sleep from her eyes, the world felt scraped clean, dangerous in its beauty, but calmer than the night before. They moved in silence through the powdery drifts toward the valley where the wreck waited, Emma's breath coming in white puffs, the straps of her medical backpack creaking under the weight of supplies, and her sister's old notebook tucked carefully inside. Calder walked ahead, scanning the slopes with the old trained instincts of a man who once expected ambushes in every shadow. Storm drifted between them, nose low, tail stiff, the husky's posture sharpened by something more than caution, as if he sensed the trail of ghosts hanging in the air. At the crash site, the silent hawk looked somehow older in the weak morning light, its fuselage half buried like a stone marker left by a vanished civilization. Calder climbed into the mangled cockpit with slow, deliberate movements, feeling the cold metal vibrate faintly beneath his palms as though the machine itself remembered impact and fire. Inside, he found a compact device shaped like a small black brick, locked by an unfamiliar mechanism and cold enough to bite through his gloves. Tucked beside it, still wrapped in plastic that had long since stiffened, lay a folded map of the Silver Pine Forest, its surface marked with red ink circles and lines that spidered across the terrain. And between the map and the ruined avionics panel, a narrow strip of paper fluttered out when Calder brushed aside a sheet of ice, handwritten coordinates scrawled in the same looping characters that Emma recognized as Lyra's. She was leaning over his shoulder when he turned the paper toward her, and the flash of recognition and pain across her face told him she had seen that handwriting many times before in the margins of engineering manuals and on the backs of grocery receipts. Before Calder could speak, Storm's growl rolled through the hollow valley like a warning bell. The dog's hackles rose, his body stiffened, his gaze locked onto a point far above them along the northern slope. Calder followed that gaze and felt the breath freeze in his throat. 3 dark figures were descending on military skis, bodies low, movements controlled, rifles gleaming dully in the muted morning. Calder didn't need explanations, not now, not with Storm's growl vibrating through the air. Emma's shocked whisper, "No, they found us," barely reached his ears before the first crack of rifle fire shattered the valley's stillness and sent echoing thunder tumbling between the walls of ice. Calder grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her toward the nearest incline. "Run! Storm! Cover!" The husky launched left like an arrow loosed from a bow, his bark splitting the air as he veered sharply, drawing one of the attackers into a rough pivot that sent the man skidding into a rock outcrop in a spray of snow and curses. Bullets stitched the ground behind Calder and Emma as they scrambled uphill, boots slipping on the crusted surface. The wind cut at their faces like knives, carrying the metallic scent of gunpowder. "They were after Lyra," Emma gasped between breaths. "The group she warned me about, private contractors, not official military. They used prototype aircraft to move illegal tech. If she got close to exposing them—" Calder didn't answer, but the realization slammed into him with the weight of an avalanche. His own crash, years ago, could easily have been engineered by the same hands. When they finally reached a narrow shelf of rock, Storm bounded back to them, snow exploding under his paws. One bullet had grazed Emma's arm, just a clean slice through her jacket, but blood already seeped through the torn fabric. Calder tugged her into a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of ice, the air trapped inside almost warm in comparison to the howling wind outside. He tore open her sleeve with careful fingers, cleaned the wound with melted snow, and wrapped it with a strip torn from his undershirt. Emma's breath faltered only once. Her eyes were fixed on him the entire time, wide, vulnerable, shining with a mix of fear and something else, something steadier, braver. "You don't have to carry this alone," she whispered, voice trembling with cold and emotion. "I can't let more people die because of me," Calder replied, thumb brushing her cheek before he realized he'd moved, the gesture soft and unfamiliar but true. Her hand found his, gripping tight. "You didn't pull me into this," she said quietly. "I stepped into it because I trust you." Storm gave a sharp bark from the cave's entrance, breaking the fragile bubble between them. Outside, faint voices drifted through the wind. The pursuers were circling the lower ridge. Calder pocketed the map, the coordinates, and the device, and led them deeper into the ravine system that twisted like veins beneath Wolf's Maw Peak. The mountains seemed to lean inward as they approached the mouth of a frozen canyon, the ice glowing an eerie blue-green under their flashlights, as if lit from within by something ancient. Storm padded ahead, stopping often to sniff at the ground where faint ski grooves and drops of fresh blood hinted that at least one pursuer had passed this way recently, wounded but still moving. The canyon walls narrowed until the air itself felt tight, their footsteps echoing off ice and stone. The deeper they went, the more Calder felt a peculiar pressure in the air, a sense that the mountain was holding its breath, waiting. When the passage finally opened into a wider chamber, Calder's light caught the glint of steel. A wall, not natural stone, but a constructed barrier, lay buried under a thick crust of frost. Pressed into the ice above the keypad lock was a message, carved crudely with the tip of a blade. "CH. Lyra was right." Emma's hand flew to her mouth, tears swelling instantly. Calder stepped forward, tracing the letters with the back of his knuckles, feeling the cold bite and the tremor of something far deeper. Recognition. Dread. A strange sense of gravity pulling him exactly where Lyra had wanted him to go. Inside the metal chamber, when the lock finally yielded to the old code scrawled in Lyra's notebook, they found a small table set with military precision. A hardened drive rested inside a phone cradle, labeled only with a date. Beside it sat a compact emergency beacon, still functional after all these years, and a small steel box painted with chipped blue enamel. Emma opened the box with shaking fingers, revealing photographs of her and Lyra as children, folded letters, and a final note written in Lyra's unmistakable hand. Words that confessed she had uncovered something monstrous and believed Calder Haynes was the only person capable of protecting Emma when darkness closed in. Emma's tears fell silently as Calder wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her against him. Storm pressed against their legs, warm and steady as if anchoring them to the earth while everything else shifted. Calder activated the beacon, its light flaring sharp and bright through the icy chamber, a promise cast into the wilderness. The response came sooner than he expected, a distant rumble, then a flood of blinding illumination bursting through the ice corridor as federal rescue teams broke through the mouth of the canyon, guided by a signal Emma had secretly sent the night before. The gunmen were already pinned in the valley outside, shouts echoing as the storm carried away the last trace of danger. Calder and Emma stood side by side beneath the fractured light spilling through the ice roof, breath mingling in cold air, realization dawning that they had crossed a threshold together that neither of them could walk back from. Storm nudged their legs gently, as if urging them forward into something new. And for the first time in many years, Calder felt not the weight of loss behind him, but the faint, fragile warmth of a future taking shape. Three wandering souls drawn together by fate, finding in each other the beginning of a home amid the frozen wilds of Silverpine. In the end, Calder, Emma, and Storm learned a truth that reaches far beyond the frozen mountains of Silverpine. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or light, but quietly, through the people and moments God places in our path. A broken man found purpose again, a grieving sister found answers, and a loyal dog became the compass that led them all toward the light. Many of us walk through our own storms, carrying burdens no one else can see, yet grace has a way of finding us even in the coldest valleys. When life feels heavy, remember this story. Remember that God can turn even the darkest mystery into a doorway toward healing, love, and new beginnings. And just like Calder learned, we are never as alone as we think. If this journey touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us which moment spoke to you the most. And if you would like to follow more stories of courage, faith, and the quiet miracles that guide us through the wilderness, make sure to subscribe to the channel. May God watch over you and everyone you love, and may He guide your steps wherever your own path may lead.